Hi, everyone. Welcome to Coffee Time with Masterminds. Last week, Peter and I started the conversation about DE&I, diversity, equity, and inclusion. We do know that in the last 3 years, nonprofit organizations have started to think about this and center it in their work. And last week, it was just two women talking about the topic, and many things came up. Well, we thought we would continue the conversation. So join us, grab yourself a cup of coffee, and hang out with us for the next 30 minutes as we talk about everything DE&I and mission-based organizations.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Coffee Time with Masterminds.
My name is Peter Blakely, and I'm the founder and principal of Blakely Consulting.
Welcome to Coffee Time with Masterminds. I am Cynthia Rojas, founder and principal of To Your Growth.
Welcome to Coffee Time with Masterminds. I'm Rebecca Tuttle, founder and principal of Grant Right Now and Grant Writing for Good.
Hi again. Welcome to Coffee Time with Masterminds, a 30-minute show with and for leaders of mission-based organizations. Today, first, I want to welcome our viewers from the U.S. and all around the world, and our podcast listeners or our radio listeners in Australia. Welcome, everyone. Please put your name and where you're from in the comments, as we always like to hear who is watching and listening to our show. So I am joined today by my co-host, Peter Blakely. Peter, how are you?
Good, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. I'm very good. And one thing I am excited about is continuing last week's conversation. It was a good one.
It was a very good one. And I think we discovered that there's a lot to address here.
There is. And so we could have this series for a long time. We do have some really interesting guests lined up coming up in the future. But I thought we could recap a little bit about what we talked about last week. And I know you brought the term DEI, which is justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Do you want to tell our viewers, remind us what that means?
Yeah, so I think that the approach came out of asking ourselves, why are we doing this, right? Are we doing diversity for diversity's sake? Or are we doing diversity for the purpose of advancing justice, right? Which is different, and probably going to be more revolutionary and more uncomfortable, right? Than just doing diversity. But so the organizations that really focus on that by putting the word justice first, I think that gives them a different lens. It says, like, we don't just have to include these people, but we need to include them in a way that is focused on dismantling systems of oppression in our organization and in our work.
Yeah, I love that. And I think today's topic digs a little deeper on that part of the DEI acronym. And then we talked a little bit last week about the pros and cons about whether we start internally and do we start externally as a nonprofit, thinking about starting or implementing a DEI effort. And you and I had a little bit of a difference of opinion, and I do have to admit that I spoke to one of our future guests, and I told her a little bit about our conversation, and she too has a different opinion. So
that's great. That's good.
We are going to revisit that. And I don't think there's a right way to do it, right? Yeah. I think there are different ways, and nonprofits would benefit if they stop, review, reflect, and pivot if they need to.
Yeah. Right? And I think the organizations that are doing this work well have all done a pivot, right? All have some experience of starting down one path and then saying, like, oh no, we've got this wrong. You know, I'm not the right person to be leading this work, or I can't be telling people to do these things, and they've made adjustments. So,
yes.
An important part of
and
the process.
Then I thought today we would talk about if we have time, because you and I enjoyed this topic last week, and so we talked about many things, but what does it mean to do this work internally inside of your organization
Yeah.
versus externally? And so if there's anyone that can tell us ways of doing it externally, it is you, because I think you clearly center JEDI and DE&I and equity in your
Thank
work.
you. I think there are even better experts.
Oh, that's
I'll talk with some of them over the next few weeks.
well, I get to experience you, so
Okay.
from my vantage point, you are the expert. But let's talk a little bit about oh man, so let's start with internally, right?
Yeah.
And I'm thinking this idea of justice, right? Okay, so we know the DE&I, right?
Yeah.
Most people start with the D, the E is a little complicated, and the I we're still working on. Well, man, are we going to get emails?
Yeah.
But let's talk about justice within an organization internally. What might that look like?
Yeah, so that means here's the really interesting thing to me is basically everything about how we work. All of our work systems and traditions and processes were developed with like no input from any marginalized people, right? Any economically disadvantaged people, any Black and brown people, in lots of cases, any women. And so we've created these, some of them are rules, but a lot of them are just traditions that maintain systems of inequality, right? You know, things like being secretive about what people get paid. It just serves to maintain pay inequality. You know, traditions about how people dress and what is considered like a professional appearance at work, privilege certain looks, certain hair textures, right? You know, certain cultural backgrounds, privileging certain ways of speaking, right? Privileges certain cultural backgrounds. And then we create these insider cultures and languages, right? That make those people advance in the organization more easily, right? You know, I've been thinking about that a lot in the world of data visualization, where data visualization gets so technical that only people with degrees can look at these visualizations and interpret them and make use of them. So they are, again, excluding the end users, right, from the information.
Yeah. And so, you know, I worked with an organization, and so this was really interesting. And so I think I've mentioned it in the show, where the organization prided itself in honoring college degrees. Now, you needed a college degree to do the work that they were doing. And so they just had a history of really honoring that, a lot of celebration around that, and promotions are based on that. And then they pivoted and they wanted to honor the lived experience, or just the experience, right?
Yeah.
So if you were a case manager for 20 years, why wouldn't you be the manager of case managers, right? And so when we started to do that, salaries were still based on education level.
Yeah.
And we did this analysis, and what we found was actually some of these managers who didn't have a college degree had larger teams, or had more accountability, or more responsibility. And we had to redo our salary structure. That's justice.
Yeah.
Right. And so it was a very interesting experience for me, looking at that and saying, wow, it was so blatant. But I also got to see it on paper. It's not as blatant if it's part of the organizational culture.
Right. And people will go through all kinds of mental gymnastics to say that like racism or sexism isn't there, right? Because we're talking about people in living, breathing environments. And so there's always confounders, right?
Yeah. We see this a lot in policies, right? And there's we see it in sick leave.
Yeah.
We see, we could go into maternity leave and talk about the
Yeah.
injustice in that.
Yeah.
But we see it in sick leave and how primary caretakers might need more sick time because they're not only taking care of their own illness, but they take care of the illness of those that they're taking care of.
Yeah.
Right. And so that imbalance, and that tends to lean more toward women as a responsibility. And so women, we know, earn less and get promoted far slower than men. As a matter of fact, you're working on a study and you found, what was the striking finding? That women with a college degree earn the same.
Earn about the same as a man with a high school diploma.
Oh my God. I want you to repeat that because that was striking to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
So a woman with a college degree earns the same as a man with a high school diploma.
Right. Yeah. Right. She started 4 years later and she starts deeply in debt. So, yeah. Yes. Right.
And so that's injustice.
And then throughout her career, right, she's probably going to be promoted a little more slowly than male colleagues, right? She's going to spend more on clothes and things like that.
Yes.
Yeah. All of that.
And that's why we need the justice in the DE&I, right? Because I guess if you send an equity, that might come up, but really looking at it from a justice purview, I think is striking.
There's this like, there are two definitions of fairness that get like discussed in this context, right? And one definition of fairness is like everybody got the same. Right. Everybody has the same access to sick leave, right? Or everybody gets paid, I don't know, based on their college degrees, and it looks fair because it's like standardized, right? But there's another approach to fairness, which is everybody gets what they need, right? And that's where we start to think about things like structural care, right? Like, should everybody have the same amount of sick leave because that's fair? Or should everybody just have as much sick leave as they need because that's equal and that's meeting their needs, right? And I think a lot of time we've fallen back on the universalist approach, which of course is like a rule written by men with an assumption that they had a wife at home caring for their families. It's kind of a rule that works for nobody at this point.
Yeah. Oh God, yeah. And then board members. So nonprofit organizations, at least many of the ones that I interact with, are still struggling. And we know that boards have a long history in being white, male, many with financial capital, many with social capital.
Yep.
And we saw it from the very beginning of boards, which, by the way, I used to know that information, and right now it is escaping me. And so we're trying to change that. And I've talked about in the show, talking to board members who are Black and brown, and they tell me, I know that I got asked because I'm Black and brown, and that doesn't feel good.
Right. And that's, some of the inequality is we have Black and brown people in the organization, and then we give them extra work to do because they're Black and brown. So can you do your job, and can you also head up this, this group for women of color, right? We're not going to pay you for it. Right? It's just extra responsibility. Yeah.
So someone was telling me that they do all the translation in their organization. Is not part of their job description, but they are fluent in 2 languages. And so she and I were doing some coaching, and she decided to tell her boss, I am no longer doing that because I don't get compensated.
Yeah.
And I thought it was interesting because we were trying to role play about how to ask for an appropriate raise because she was getting promoted, but being told that she would, but she knew that she would be earning less than the person that she was replacing.
Yeah.
And so we were working around that, and she went in starting there. And I thought that was interesting. It ended up really well and that she did get more money. And so I do think that her boss realized that
Heard
she
it.
was starting to advocate for herself. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that translation issue, that is such a tricky one.
it is. It is. And I do want to admit, Peter,
Yeah.
as someone who has worked in nonprofit organizations, and this is not an excuse, but it is awfully expensive.
It is really expensive. It's really hard to manage.
Yes.
So it changes all your deadlines, right? It's a complicated piece in your project management flow. And you're doing it because you want to include some members of the community who don't speak English as a first language. So your heart is kind of in the right place.
Yeah.
And you can still execute badly by asking somebody to do extra unpaid work just because they can write Spanish or Mandarin or whatever it is.
Yeah. Yeah. So really looking out for that. But with boards also, what I am finding is that it is one thing to want to diversify your board.
Yeah.
It is another thing for the existing board to become a welcoming environment. Yeah. And I find that missing from the equation.
And, boards are an interesting example because they're kind of inside, kind of outside, right?
Yeah.
They're like, they are not staff. They're not embedded in your organization. That's their strength, that they have a little bit broader view. And ideally, they're a place to connect with your community, right? And your organizational allies. But boards also have all of these like just weird traditions and ways that boards operate. And of course, the whole idea of boards was invented in a certain cultural context. And and without it, and we talked in your board series about how many board members really don't know what they're doing, like don't know how to be on a board, don't know how to participate, don't know what they're being asked to do. So unless this organization is like very, very actively managed, it's just going to fall back in these patterns, right? Where more confident people who talk a lot, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And so we also have to think about, when we think about diversity, is the generations. Our generations are different. It's so interesting. I am Gen X, and between Gen X and Gen Y, huge difference. So imagine baby boomer and Gen Z.
And this, I don't know what we call like the generation now that is just transitioning out of college
Z
into the workforce.
Yeah, I was millennials.
They kind of came of age during a global pandemic. It was a weird time. And they are just transitioning into a completely different adulthood than we did.
Yeah.
And, we don't get them and they don't get us, right? Mm-hmm. But I think there are some things about this culture, about like kind of coming of age in a really hard time, right? Of coming of age in an era where everybody was having a hard time simultaneously. And it was like, okay to be having a hard time and to acknowledge that. There's a lot of value in that, but we've got to figure out how to communicate across that divide of, we just show up and do our work anyway, no matter what is happening.
Yeah.
And which again, let's just reiterate that the reason we think we have to show up to work all the time and act like nothing's happening is because of this ideal worker persona who was a white man who had a woman running his household for him, right? So he didn't have to leave in time for pickup. He didn't have to run home because his kid got a fever at daycare, right? And that's become the standard for how people act at work. Is like somebody else is running their household. And I think that was the best thing about the pandemic was we understood like that's not how it works for anybody.
Right? Yeah. And you know what's really interesting to me is like the whole world feels like they're open
Yeah.
from 9 to 5, right? So
Yeah.
the dentist, and so yesterday
Yeah.
I was talking to someone who kept apologizing because they had to leave in the middle of the workday to
Yeah.
go to the dentist, and I'm like, I get it. The dentist is not open till 8 p.m.
Yeah.
Right. And so doctors often, and so
Yeah.
yes, there are doctors, please don't send me an email. There are doctors who have late time appointments, but it's not usually, there's not a lot of
Yeah.
availability. The
Yeah.
banks, unless you go Friday at 7 p.m., they close at 5. And it's like,
Yeah.
well, if I'm working 9 to 5 and you're working 9 to 5, then how are we
getting any of this
Yeah.
time? Yeah. I mean, I was remembering how, when I was single and had a job, how impossible it was to get anything done at my house,
Yes.
right? Like you could not possibly get something repaired or, get the gas turned back on after a repair or get an appliance repairman in or get your trees trimmed without calling out of work for multiple days because they may or may not show up on that day.
Yeah.
I don't know how we got anything done before we all worked from home.
I know. And you know what's really interesting? Well, what's really interesting is that this is supposed to be a Jedi conversation, and we're talking about
We're just venting about our own experiences, and that's your Jedi conversation.
We can do it. It's our show. So one thing that's really interesting to me is that I'm starting to, in my own evolving process of maximizing my productivity, I am back to running my chores during the weekend, which is what I did when I worked in an office.
Yeah.
And oh my, it gives you no rest time.
Yeah.
And I'm like, this is not fair. And yet I did it for all of my life until the pandemic, until I became a consultant and I had the flexibility of running to the post office, which by the way, I have to go to, and I can't seem to find the time because they close at 5 o'clock. So
that's why I don't work on Fridays.
Yeah.
So that I can actually rest on the weekends.
Yeah, because I feel like I get no rest now that I'm doing all my chores on the weekends to try to maximize my productivity.
And I think that's what most people do.
We have
all weekend.
Yeah, we have a way to go.
Yeah.
We still have a way to go. And then I want us to at least touch upon processes, right? There are ways in which we do work that are not justified or are not equitable, right? Especially if you're neurodivergent or if
that is a huge area, that we have not even talked about.
I know.
That is getting a lot of attention recently, and it's really important.
Yeah. And so, having an organization look at things such as, I'm going to tell you something really simple, meetings, right? I worked with an organization that had different locations, and this is when their meetings were in person. And so people had to drive to meetings, and they were still booking a 1 o'clock, a 2 o'clock, a 3 o'clock, or they would have a 1 to 2:30 and then have a 3 o'clock. And so there was no time for eating. There was rarely any time to get to the next place. They ended up with a heavy culture of lateness, right? And so the unfairness of how your brain has to reset for this new meeting, new topic, new people, it's just unfair. And so looking at your culture and looking at your processes would probably open a new can of worms if you haven't done it already, because I know that there are nonprofits that are working really hard to do that.
Yeah, and I would be interested to hear what they are doing or how they approach it. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then what happens to individuals who don't type fast, right? But there's an expectation of productivity.
Yeah.
Right? And then you have some that type really fast, or you use different platforms. You use an array of different platforms, and some people, and it's not always generational, but some people it's just hard to handle.
Yeah.
It's really hard to handle. Like, did that come through an email, or was it Slack, or was it chat, or was it Microsoft
Yeah.
Teams?
So there's so much about like the
Was
workplace
that
that
a
is designed to be so distracting, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
that it
it's
really, yeah.
let's look at our processes and
Yeah.
see, and do I really have to show up at work at 9?
Mm-hmm.
Do you really need me there at 9? Let's reevaluate that. So, okay.
Yeah.
And then we only have a few minutes that, oh my God, we've already exhausted almost 30 minutes. But I want to talk about the things you do in your evaluation work.
Yeah.
It really centers equity.
Yeah.
And nonprofits can think about this as they think about the external work that needs to be done in terms of JEDI.
Yeah. So to me, here's the first thing. Like, a lot of programs have traditionally been developed with the program leadership defining success for the participants, right? And a lot of times it looks like, well, this will be successful when they look more like us, right? So one of the things that I always do is ask the participants or the community, like, what is success going to look like here? And how are you going to know that it was successful? What is a vibrant neighborhood going to look like for you as residents of this neighborhood? Because I think residents of other neighborhoods are going to think like we've been successful when it looks like our town, and that's not what these communities are supposed to be like. So that's a huge one. There are also very simple practices on things like disaggregating your data. You always have to disaggregate your data because there is always an inequality to find. And we're going to do a show in a couple of weeks with some people who are looking at how they disaggregated their data and how they disaggregated it to make sure that it was useful for the community that they were working in. So that'll be really interesting. And I have also been doing some thinking and talking about presenting data and how certain types of data presentation can stimulate certain types of conversations and certain types of policy interventions and approaches. And very subtle adjustments, right, in how you present data can stimulate a whole different conversation, right? One of the big ones is, are we comparing everybody to white people? Or are we comparing everybody to an ambitious and realistic target that is what we want for this population, and how the latter decenters whiteness? Now that I've been, in these conversations, I'm learning how little I know and how we also have to think about, like, how do we present data so that less technical people can engage in the conversation, right? So, for example, caseworkers who don't have college degrees but have tons of experience, right, don't get turned off by our fancy charts and not participate in conversations about how to make our programs better. How do we present data so that people with lived experience can participate in the conversation, right? How do we present data so that neurodiverse people or people with vision issues and disabilities can participate? It's infinite.
Oh yeah. And so nonprofits get overwhelmed by that, but you don't have to start with everyone. Start where it matters right now. And then as the process goes, trust me, this gets easier. You will
it's a mindset, right?
Yeah. You will naturally start thinking, when I go to restaurants, I mean, my mom is needing more and more help. And it's really interesting how now when I look at a space, I think, are you wheelchair accessible? Do you have a ramp? How tall is your step? Right. Yeah. And so you just naturally start to look at those things. So for nonprofits, our message is, and we hope that through our conversations, you realize that this is where it begins, right? It starts with the conversation and it should not end. There is no destination. There's learning to be had.
Yeah, right. And I don't think, nobody has solved this yet.
Right.
I don't think there is an end point to this.
Right. It's how we should be.
Yeah, I think it's an approach and a process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, this is part 2, and we're excited that in the next following weeks, we're going to have some really interesting folks continuing the conversation. So we want to wish everyone a wonderful weekend, and thank you for joining us.
Have a great weekend.
Bye.